The 4-year mark of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has come and gone, but the conflict has arrived at a juncture that few geopolitical analysts could have accurately predicted 12 months ago. Rather than a frozen conflict or a slow, grinding advance by Russian forces, the battlefield and the home front are now witnessing what some military strategists are describing as the most significant shift in momentum since the autumn of 2022. While official Kremlin statements maintain a facade of steady progress towards the so-called special military operations goals, a confluence of internal decay, staggering human toll, and economic fragmentation is painting a very different picture, one where the concept of mass surrender and systemic collapse is no longer a speculative fantasy, but a tangible dynamic taking shape along the front lines and deep within the Russian heartland. The notion of 250,000 Russian personnel being rendered combat ineffective through surrender, desertion, and catastrophic casualty rates is not merely a headline. It represents a structural failure of the Russian state's ability to wage war, a failure that is sending shockwaves through the global order. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must first grasp the sheer scale of the attrition that has befallen the Russian military machine. For months, the narrative focused on Russia's ability to replenish its ranks through relentless recruitment drives in the regions and the use of human wave tactics, often referred to as meat grinders, which through poorly trained conscripts and prisoners, turned soldiers at fortified Ukrainian positions. However, the mathematics of this approach have finally caught up with the Kremlin. By early 2026, estimates from independent research groups and military analysts, including those cited by the Institute for the Study of War, suggest that Russia's total casualties killed and wounded have soared past the 900,000 mark, with some projections placing the figure closer to 1.3 million. Within this staggering number, the death toll is believed to have eclipsed 250,000, a figure that dwarfs Soviet losses in the decade-long Afghanistan campaign by a factor of more than 20. The human cost is so immense that the Kremlin's own financial structures are buckling. The state now pays out more in survivor benefits to the families of hundreds of thousands of dead soldiers than it allocates to the salaries of active troops or the recruitment of new ones. This brutal arithmetic has created a crisis of morale and manpower that is now manifesting in unprecedented numbers of Russian personnel seeking to escape the fight. What was once a trickle of individual desertions has, according to reports from partisan movements operating in occupied Ukraine and verified accounts from soldiers who have fled, swelled into a wave of refusals to fight and organized surrenders. On the southern Kherson front, desertion rates have spiked so dramatically that commanding officers have resorted to confiscating their soldiers' bank cards in a desperate attempt to prevent them from fleeing their positions. This is not merely the fear of a few isolated conscripts, it is a systemic breakdown in discipline. Units from elite formations, such as Russia's 217th Parachute Brigade, have seen dozens of soldiers abandon their posts simultaneously. These are not isolated incidents but symptoms of a deep-seated rot within the ranks, where the motivation to fight has been extinguished by the grim reality of pointless assaults and the callous disregard for human life exhibited by their own commanders. Testimonies emerging from Russian soldiers who have managed to escape to exile paint a harrowing picture of a military where the greatest threat to a soldier's life is sometimes his own officer corps. Accounts have emerged of the practice known as zeroing, a brutal military slang term for the execution of one's own troops. 4 Russian soldiers who fled the front told the BBC they witnessed fellow servicemen being summarily executed on the spot for refusing orders to participate in suicidal attacks. One survivor described a pit containing the bodies of 20 soldiers who had been zeroed by their officers after refusing to advance into a Ukrainian kill zone. The testimony of a soldier named Ilya, the sole survivor of a squad of 79 men, encapsulates the depth of this despair. He spoke of a deep-seated hatred for the system that consumes its own, a sentiment echoed by a former medic, Dima, who stated, "In the Russian army there are too many guys who don't need this war, who hate commanders, who hate Putin, who hate our system, and they need to break us." These are not the words of a motivated, conquering army. They are the death rattles of a force held together by coercion and fear, now collapsing under its own weight. The phenomenon of surrender and desertion is inextricably linked to the catastrophic rate at which Russia is consuming its military-aged population. The pace of loss has become so unsustainable that for the first time since the full-scale invasion began, Russian battlefield losses are outstripping the military's capacity to recruit new forces. This is the core of the crisis facing the Kremlin. For years, President Vladimir Putin gambled on the assumption that Russia's significantly larger population base would allow it to absorb losses that Ukraine could not. That bet is now failing. The state is scraping the bottom of the barrel, increasingly reliant on coercing migrants, enticing the most desperate with promises of fast cash that often go unfulfilled, and burning through the pool of willing volunteers. The result is a fighting force that is not only shrinking in capability but is also increasingly unreliable, composed of men who have no desire to die for a cause they do not understand. The numbers on the map reflect this internal decay. While Russian forces have made marginal gains in certain sectors, grinding forward at a terrible cost, the strategic reality is one of abject failure. The Russian military seized a mere 0.8% of Ukrainian territory in the entirety of 2025, paying a price of 92 casualties for every single square kilometer they managed to capture. This rate of advance is not the hallmark of a powerful military on the path to victory, it is the desperate clawing of an exhausted giant. As one analysis starkly put it, at the current pace, it would take Russia 80 years to conquer the whole of Ukraine. This grinding stagnation is the direct cause of the collapsing morale on the front lines. Soldiers are intelligent enough to recognize futility. They see their comrades dying by the thousands for tiny, worthless patches of ground, and they understand that there is no end in sight. This realization is the primary driver behind the growing movement to surrender not just to save one's own life, but to escape a war that has no purpose other than its own continuation. This collapse at the front is mirrored by an even more profound disintegration at home. The Russian economy, once vaunted for its fortress Russia stability, has been fundamentally and perhaps irreversibly transformed by the war effort. The Kremlin is now devoting an estimated 40% of its entire budget to the war, a level of militarization that is grotesquely distorting the economy. While official propaganda touts low unemployment and wage growth in the defense sector, this is a mirage built on the production of weapons and shells goods that do not contribute to sustainable economic growth, do not improve the lives of citizens, and cannot be consumed. This is the classic death spiral of a war economy. The more the state pours into the military-industrial complex, the more it starves the civilian sectors that form the actual basis of a functioning society. The opportunity costs are staggering, and economists are warning of a looming monetary overhang, a situation where too much money chases too few goods, leading to hyperinflation and economic collapse, similar to the events that took place under the Tsars and the Soviets. The much-vaunted resilience of the Russian economy is a facade built upon increasingly shaky foundations. Oil revenues, the lifeblood of the Kremlin's war chest, are under unprecedented threat. The price of oil has been sliding due to global market instability and the threat of a broader trade war, and Russia's access to buyers is shrinking. While Moscow has constructed a shadow fleet of aging tankers to evade sanctions, this fleet is costly, dangerous, and environmentally catastrophic. More importantly, its effectiveness is waning as international pressure mounts. Russia's income from gas sales to the European Union, once its primary market, was 40% lower in 2025 than it was in 2021 before the war began, and experts predict the total loss of these revenues within the next 2 years. Even more alarming for the Kremlin is the potential loss of its remaining major customers. India, which has been a key buyer of discounted Russian crude, is now pivoting away, with reports indicating that Indian refineries have signed a deal with Venezuela, finding a substitute that threatens to cut Moscow out of a crucial market. This leaves China as the only remaining alternative buyer, but Beijing is well aware of its leverage and is demanding steep discounts, making sales potentially unprofitable for Moscow. The stark reality, according to independent economists, is that the Kremlin may soon be forced to confiscate household savings from its own citizens to cover its ballooning budget deficit, a move that would be politically explosive. The economic desperation is also fracturing the previously unshakable alliance between the Kremlin and the regional elites who form the backbone of Putin's power. The social contract that kept regional governors loyal, delivering stability and resources from the center in exchange for political control, has been shattered by the demands of the war. Regional leaders are being saddled with the impossible task of meeting ever-increasing recruitment quotas without the necessary funding from Moscow. They are being arrested at an alarming rate on corruption charges that were previously ignored, a clear signal from the Kremlin that loyalty is no longer a shield against repression. The tragic suicide of Kursk Governor Roman Starovoyt, who faced criminal prosecution despite having long played by the rules of the system, is a stark warning to every regional official in Russia. No one is safe. This creates a feedback loop of instability. As regional elites become more insecure, their ability and willingness to enforce Kremlin policy wanes, accelerating the decay of state control from the periphery inward. Simultaneously, the class of Russians who initially benefited from the war is now facing a stark reversal of fortune. The high signing bonuses and lucrative salaries promised to recruits have proven to be temporary and illusory. A sense of crisis is spreading through the population of economically and socially disadvantaged groups who hope that participation in the Kremlin's war against Ukraine would raise their standing. This is a ticking time bomb. The state is now preparing for the return of hundreds of thousands of veterans men trained in violence, traumatized by combat, and expecting the continued financial support and social status they were promised. Yet, the economy has no place for them. Employers, fearing the psychological instability of returning soldiers, are refusing to hire them, especially those with disabilities. Veterans are finding that their sacrifice has earned them nothing but a permanent scar and a one-way ticket to the margins of society. As one Ukrainian diplomat warned, this conditional demobilization of at least 500 to 600,000 people will result in a return of hardened criminals who will come back home and want the same treatment they had in the army. When they don't get it, the result will be total chaos and a carnival of murderers, rapists, and so on, destabilizing regions across Russia. It is within this context of a bleeding army, a collapsing economy, and a fracturing society that the news of mass Russian capitulation must be understood. These are not merely 250,000 individual decisions, they are the collective result of a system that has run out of men, money, and motivation. The desertions, the surrenders, the refusals to fight are the logical endpoint of an imperial adventure that was doomed from the moment it became clear that Ukraine would not fall. The Russian state has gutted its future for the sake of territorial gains so small they are invisible on a map of the continent. It has squandered the lives of a generation, alienated its own elites, and built an economy that functions only as long as it is producing instruments of death. And now, as the true cost becomes undeniable to even the most indoctrinated soldier in the trenches, the only rational choice left is to stop fighting. This is not a defeat that can be spun into victory by propaganda. It is a foundational collapse that is happening in real time, and its implications will reverberate from the battlefields of eastern Ukraine to the streets of Moscow and the corridors of power in Washington, Brussels, and Beijing. The second part of this report will delve into the geopolitical and global ramifications of this unprecedented shift, examining why the world must now prepare for the consequences of a failing Russia. Part 2. The internal collapse of the Russian military and the fracturing of its society are not isolated phenomena confined within the borders of the former Soviet Union. The spectacle of a nuclear-armed power seeing its army disintegrate through mass desertion and surrender, its economy hollowed out by militarization, and its social contract in tatters, sends a seismic tremor through the entire architecture of global security. The world is now confronted with a paradox of immense strategic danger. The weakening of a revisionist state does not necessarily equate to a more stable international order. In fact, the desperation emanating from the Kremlin, fueled by the humiliation of battlefield defeat and the recognition of systemic failure, is creating a volatile cocktail that could have consequences far more unpredictable and destructive than the war in Ukraine itself. The international community is watching a superpower in slow-motion crisis, and the reactions from capitals around the world reveal a complex tapestry of fear, opportunism, and realignment that is reshaping the 21st century geopolitical landscape. For the Western alliance, particularly the United States and its NATO partners, the prospect of a Russian military collapse presents a profound strategic dilemma. For 3 years, the primary objective of Western policy has been to support Ukraine's defense while carefully avoiding a direct military confrontation with Moscow, a conflict that could rapidly escalate to the nuclear level. This policy of calibrated escalation management has been largely successful, but it is now being tested by the very success of its own approach. The disintegration of Russian conventional forces removes the immediate land-based threat to NATO's eastern flank that so terrified European capitals in the weeks following the February 2022 invasion. However, it replaces that threat with a far more nebulous and dangerous one: the instability of a nuclear-armed state with a revisionist leader who has staked his entire legacy on a war he is now visibly losing. Military planners in Washington and Brussels are now forced to game out scenarios that were once considered unthinkable, ranging from the accidental or unauthorized launch of a tactical nuclear weapon from a desperate forward commander to a deliberate act of escalation designed to freeze the conflict lines and prevent a total rout. The economic warfare waged by the West, in coordination with allies like the G7 and the European Union, has played a significant role in accelerating Russia's internal decay. The sanctions regime, initially dismissed by skeptics as toothless, has operated as a slow-acting poison, gradually cutting off Russia from the advanced technologies necessary to maintain its military-industrial complex and the financial flows required to lubricate its wartime economy. The imposition of a price cap on Russian oil, while leaky and imperfect, has nevertheless forced Moscow to spend billions of dollars on a shadow fleet of uninsured, aging tankers to move its crude, drastically cutting into its profits. The decision by the United States to target Russia's shadow fleet with direct sanctions, blacklisting individual vessels and their owners, is a significant escalation of this economic pressure, making it increasingly difficult and expensive for Moscow to find buyers and transport its most vital export. The cumulative effect of these measures is now being felt in the Kremlin's budget, where the gap between military spending and sustainable revenue is becoming an unbridgeable chasm. Yet, the Western response is not monolithic. The unity that characterized the alliance in the first year of the war has shown signs of strain as the conflict has dragged on, and its economic consequences have rippled across the globe. European nations, in particular, are grappling with the domestic political fallout of high energy prices and the cost of living crisis, which has emboldened populist and far-right movements that are traditionally more sympathetic to Moscow. The question of how to manage a post-war Russia, or a Russia in the midst of a protracted collapse, is already a source of quiet but intense debate. Some capitals, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe with long memories of Soviet domination, advocate for a policy of total strategic defeat and the dismantling of Russia's imperial capacity to wage war. Others, particularly in Western Europe, are more cautious, fearing that the complete disintegration of the Russian state could unleash waves of instability, refugees, and uncontrolled proliferation of weapons and materials that would directly threaten the continent's security. This internal tension within NATO and the EU will only intensify as the situation on the ground in Ukraine deteriorates further for Russian forces. The response from the Global South, a term encompassing the non-aligned nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, has been one of studied ambiguity that is now beginning to shift. For much of the war, countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa maintained a neutral stance, abstaining from UN votes condemning Russia and eagerly purchasing its discounted oil and gas. This was driven by a combination of historical ties, economic self-interest, and a deep-seated suspicion of Western-led international order. However, the narrative of Russia as a reliable partner and a necessary counterweight to Western hegemony is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of its obvious military and economic failures. The deal between Indian refineries and Venezuela, cutting into Russia's market share, is a clear signal that even Moscow's most important remaining customers are beginning to hedge their bets. As Russia's capacity to project power and provide economic benefits shrinks, its influence in these regions will inevitably wane. The Kremlin's ability to pose as the defender of a multipolar world order rings hollow when it cannot defend its own territory or pay its own soldiers. China's role in this evolving drama is perhaps the most critical and closely watched variable of all. As Russia's primary economic lifeline and political backer, Beijing holds the key to Moscow's survival. Yet, the relationship is not one of equals. It is a deeply asymmetrical partnership where China is the senior partner. For years, Beijing has benefited from discounted Russian energy, access to Russian resources that were previously off-limits, and a useful strategic partner to distract the United States in Europe while China expands its influence in the Indo-Pacific. However, a Russia on the verge of internal collapse is not in China's interest. A failed Russian state, weak and chaotic, would become a source of regional instability on China's own border, potentially drawing Beijing into costly interventions or creating a security vacuum that the West could fill. At the same time, China is acutely aware of the dangers of being too closely associated with a losing power. The Chinese Communist Party's own legitimacy rests on its ability to deliver economic prosperity and stability. Propping up a failing Russian war machine indefinitely is a drain on Chinese resources and a potential reputational liability. Chinese leaders are therefore engaged in a delicate balancing act. They continue to provide Russia with the economic oxygen it needs to avoid immediate collapse, purchasing its energy and exporting dual-use technologies that keep its factories running. Yet, there are clear limits to this support. China has studiously avoided providing lethal military aid to Russia, a red line that would trigger a catastrophic rupture with Europe and the United States. More importantly, Beijing's behavior suggests it is positioning itself to be the ultimate arbiter of any post-war settlement. By maintaining a channel of communication with Ukraine and continuing to tout its own peace plan, China is building a bridge to both sides. The calculation is clear: when Russia is finally forced to negotiate seriously, it will have no one to turn to but China. This would give Beijing unprecedented leverage over its northern neighbor, potentially allowing it to dictate the terms of a new security architecture in Eurasia that serves Chinese interests above all others. As one analyst noted, China is likely to come to the Kremlin with its own demands, expecting payment for its continued support, and that payment may well come in the form of strategic assets, infrastructure concessions, and a subservient role for Russia in China's orbit. The internal political implications within Russia are the darkest and most uncertain variable in this equation. For the past quarter of a century, the stability of the Russian political system has rested on the twin pillars of rising living standards and the unquestioned authority of Vladimir Putin. Both pillars are now crumbling. The economic model, built on hydrocarbon rents distributed downward through a network of loyal elites, has been shattered by war and sanctions. The political model, built on the image of Putin as the guarantor of stability and the defender of Russian greatness, has been fatally wounded by the catastrophic failure of his primary project. The regime is now forced to rely almost exclusively on repression to maintain control, but repression is a tool of management, not a source of legitimacy. It can silence dissent, but it cannot motivate a population to sacrifice or inspire soldiers to fight. The regime is entering a phase that political scientists call autocratic decay, where the institutions of the state, the military, the security services, the bureaucracy begin to turn inward, consumed by infighting and corruption as the unifying external threat of the West and the unifying goal of victory in Ukraine recede from view. The potential for internal unrest is no longer a distant possibility, but a looming certainty. The return of hundreds of thousands of traumatized, disgruntled, and armed veterans to a society that has no place for them is a recipe for social explosion. These men have been taught to solve problems with violence and have been promised a hero's welcome and a lifetime of support. When they find only poverty, unemployment, and indifference, their anger will not be directed at the abstract concept of the West, but at the tangible system that used and discarded them. This could manifest in a wave of localized violence, organized crime, or even coalesce into a broader political movement demanding accountability. The security services, already stretched thin by the demands of the war and the need to suppress domestic dissent, will be overwhelmed. The prospect of a carnival of murderers, as one Ukrainian diplomat warned, destabilizing entire regions, is a terrifying scenario not just for Russians, but for the entire world, as it would create a massive humanitarian and security black hole on the European continent. Simultaneously, the loyalty of the security elites, the Siloviki who form the inner core of the Putin system, is coming under unprecedented strain. They see the same data on casualties, the same economic projections, and the same collapsing morale as everyone else. They understand that the war is unwinnable and that continuing it risks not just their personal fortunes, but the survival of the state they are sworn to protect. Yet, they are also trapped by their own complicity. They have spent years enriching themselves through the system and enforcing its will. A change of leadership could bring with it investigations, asset seizures, and prison sentences. This creates a dangerous dynamic where the elites may cling to power even as the ship sinks, believing that any outcome, even a disastrous one, is preferable to the personal accountability that would come with defeat. The question of whether the security services will remain loyal to Putin personally, or whether they will decide that removing him is the only way to salvage the situation and negotiate an end to the war, is the single most important political question in the world today. There is no historical precedent for a leader surviving the kind of catastrophic military and economic failure that is now unfolding in Russia. The global economic consequences of a prolonged Russian collapse are equally profound and impossible to fully predict. The energy markets, already volatile due to the war and OPEC+ maneuvering, would face another period of extreme uncertainty. A chaotic collapse of Russian oil and gas production, whether due to sanctions, infrastructure decay, or internal instability, could send global energy prices soaring, triggering a worldwide recession. Conversely, a desperate Russia might try to flood the market with discounted energy to raise cash, crashing prices and bankrupting other producers, including American shale companies and OPEC members. The global financial system would be tested by the potential for massive Russian corporate and sovereign defaults, sending shockwaves through European banks that still hold exposure to Russian assets. The interconnected nature of the modern global economy means that a collapse of a major economy like Russia cannot be contained. Its effects will ripple through supply chains, commodity markets, and financial institutions worldwide. Furthermore, the era of food security anxiety, which defined the first years of the war, could return with a vengeance. Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, has continued to export grain through its Black Sea corridor, but this remains a fragile achievement dependent on naval security and the continued operation of ports. A Russian escalation designed to disrupt these exports, or a collapse that leads to a naval free-for-all in the Black Sea, could once again cut off vital supplies to the Middle East and Africa, triggering new waves of hunger and political instability in the most vulnerable regions of the globe. The war has already demonstrated how a regional conflict can trigger global food crises, and a further deterioration of the situation only heightens that risk. In this environment of escalating risk and uncertainty, the only actor with a clear and consistent strategy appears to be Ukraine. For Kyiv, the goal has never wavered: the complete restoration of its territorial integrity and the defeat of the Russian invasion. The reports of mass Russian desertions and surrenders are not just propaganda victories. They are tangible evidence that the strategy of attritional defense, combined with deep strikes on Russian logistics and command nodes, is working. Ukrainian military planners are now faced with the challenge of how to exploit this collapse. The temptation is to launch a major offensive to shatter Russian lines completely and liberate as much territory as possible before the Kremlin can regroup. However, there are also risks. Overextending Ukrainian forces could create vulnerabilities, and a dramatic Ukrainian advance could provoke the very desperate Russian escalation that everyone fears. The Ukrainian leadership must walk a tightrope, prosecuting the war to its strategic conclusion while managing the expectations of its Western backers and preparing for the immense challenges of post-war reconstruction and European integration. The international legal order is also being reshaped by these events. The warrants issued by the International Criminal Court for Russian leaders, including Vladimir Putin, for the forced deportation of Ukrainian children, have established a new precedent for accountability. While the likelihood of these individuals ever facing trial in The Hague is currently low, the warrants have a symbolic and practical effect. They limit the ability of these leaders to travel internationally and signal that the era of impunity for the crime of aggression may be coming to an end. The creation of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression, supported by a coalition of Western and like-minded nations, is another step towards codifying the principle that launching a war of conquest has legal consequences. These developments, while long-term in nature, are part of the broader reshaping of global norms that is underway as a direct result of the war. Ultimately, what is unfolding in Russia is not merely a military defeat or an economic crisis, it is the unmaking of a state that has spent decades building a narrative of revanchist power and inevitable resurgence. The image of a resurgent Russia, capable of challenging the United States and reshaping the European order, has been shattered on the battlefields of Ukraine. In its place is the reality of a decaying power, its army hollowed out, its economy a Potemkin village of defense factories and shadow fleets, and its society traumatized by loss and poisoned by propaganda. The 250,000 Russian soldiers who have surrendered, deserted, or been rendered combat ineffective are not a statistic, they are a symbol of this systemic collapse. They represent the moment when the human cost of imperial ambition finally exceeded the capacity of the state to compel its citizens to pay it. The world now watches, holds its breath, and prepares for the unpredictable and dangerous fallout of a great power's disintegration. The consequences will define the next decade of global affairs, long after the last shot is fired in Ukraine.